You're listening to Truth Warrior. My name is David Whitehead, and we are broadcasting live from truthfrequencyradio.com. And today it is Sunday, January 18th. I got to get used to saying Sunday. Recently changed time slots. It's working out pretty well. But I am happy to be here with you again tonight. I have a show lined up for you that I've been looking forward to for quite some time. Speaking tonight to the great Michael Cremo. And we are going to be talking about the hidden history of the human race. And I'm also very excited to announce that we are also going to be featuring Michael Cremo on the upcoming Modern Knowledge Tour of Canada, which is taking place across the country this summer throughout August. And he's going to be speaking in the West Coast there at Victoria and Vancouver stops. And we're very excited to hear what he's got to say. He's been doing a long time, a lot of work on human history, the origins, the forbidden aspects that are not allowed to be put out there by the mainstream scientific establishment. We're going to get into that with him in a few minutes once I connect with him. And I think that this question of who we are, where we come from, and what really happened in the ancient past is a question that it's pretended by mainstream academics to be answered. It's assumed to be answered by various religious factions, but the truth is that a lot of those arguments don't fully stand up when you really analyze it. And they've been arguing back and forth. You have sort of the creationists versus the Darwinian evolutionists, and they go back and forth, on and on and on. This argument has gone. And I personally just care about what the truth is. I just want to know what's really going on when it comes to our origins. I want to know where I came from. I want to know how I got here and what the heck I'm supposed to be doing here. This is really the whole point. And I think this is one of the biggest questions that's been asked by philosophers and thinkers and historians and scientists and people of all types since the origin of our species here is this feeling of amnesia that we all experience. And so we're going to try to get to the bottom of that tonight with my guest. And I highly, highly recommend this man's work. And it is not the type of work that you can just take lightly and you can look at it and watch a 5-minute YouTube video and think that you totally understand the type of evidence that Michael is bringing forward. What you really need to do is check out his work. You need to go and look at the books. You got to go and there has been some fantastic interviews, of course, that he's done over the years. I'm sure I do not really need to introduce him on the show today. I'm sure you're familiar with him. But if you're not familiar with his work or familiar with this type of analysis that's been done, which is showcasing that the human race is much, much older than is widely accepted in the mainstream academic circles, and also especially in sort of the Judeo-Christian model of looking at things as we do here in the West. So this is something that you need to go and check out his work. You can go to many of his websites. You can also check out, we have a great bio written up on Michael's work at our website, modernknowledge.ca. And you can also check out some tickets and whatnot if you're interested in coming to those events, if you're in Canada at that time. We're also going to be trying to live stream either both the Vancouver and the Victoria event, or at least one of them. So that way, if you're not in the area and you do want to be a part of that event, you can still take part. So I'll bring out some more information on that as we go. But nonetheless, we're very grateful to have Michael on board. And I think this is definitely going to be an exciting show. And I do see that he has popped in the queue, so I'm going to go ahead and welcome and bring him on the air. He needs no introduction on this show. We're very honored to have him. Michael Cremo, are you there, my friend? Can you hear me?
Yes, I am. I'm here. I can hear you.
Excellent. Well, you're coming through loud and clear, Michael, and I'm very, very grateful that you took time out of your busy schedule to speak with me tonight. I've been looking forward to this interview for quite some time, and you're more than welcome, so thanks for joining me.
Good to be with you and all your listeners.
Well, Michael, we wanted to get into as much of your work as we possibly can in tonight's show. I know that a radio show can't really do justice to the amount of documentation and evidence that I'm sure you would like to review, but we're going to do our very best here. And we do have new listeners tuning in all the time. I notice that when I speak to especially the younger generation, there is a great desire to learn the questions as we're going to be tackling tonight, which is, what is the origin of the human species? Is there a hidden history of the human race? And what kind of information can we share with people to sort of get them acquainted with your work and get them started on that path of asking that question and looking at the evidence that you've brought forward? So maybe we could just do a little introduction to your work, the books that you've written, and then we can get into some specific questions here.
Okay, that's fine. So the book that I'm most known for is called Forbidden Archaeology, and that has to do with archaeological evidence for extreme human antiquity. Most scientists today believe that humans like us first appeared less than 200,000 years ago, having evolved from more primitive ape-like human ancestors. And that's what you'll see in all of the textbooks of archaeology and biology, that you study in high school or university. But what is not mentioned in those books is that over the past 150 years or so, archaeologists, geologists, and other scientists who are digging into the earth have found evidence that contradicts what's being taught in the schools. They have found human bones, human artifacts, and human footprints that go back, in some cases, many millions of years, in any case, far more than 200,000 years ago. So this evidence is published in the original scientific reports, but it's not mentioned in today's textbooks, and that's why I call this topic Forbidden Archaeology. It's evidence, real evidence, but it's just not mentioned in the textbooks today because it contradicts the dominant theories that most scientists today now hold. So that book, Forbidden Archaeology, is about 900 pages long, and some people asked for a shorter version of the book, so I brought out a shorter edition of it. It's called The Hidden History of the Human Race. It's about 300 pages long instead of 900 pages, but it's pretty amazing. Most of the people who are into this topic, they prefer the longer book for some reason. I guess they want to make sure they're not missing out on anything. But a shorter edition of the book is there. It's called The Hidden History of the Human Race. And people would ask me also, what has been the reaction of scientists and other people to your work? So to answer that question, I put together a book called Forbidden Archaeology's Impact, where I give all of the reactions of scientists to my work, both the negative and the positive, along with my responses. And then people would ask me another question. If you've got all of this evidence suggesting that what we now hear in the schools about human origins is not true, then how do you think humans came about? If the Darwinian theory of evolution isn't true, then what did happen? If we didn't evolve from apes, where did we come from? So to answer that book, to answer that question, I wrote a book called Human Devolution, a Vedic alternative to Darwin's theory. And in that book, I propose that before we even ask the question, where did human beings come from, we should first of all ask the question, what is a human being? And today, many scientists are going to say that a human being or any other living thing is just a combination of the chemical elements. We're just machines made of matter, they would say. But I'm proposing that we're not just machines made of matter, we're beings of pure consciousness, ultimately. Matter does not produce consciousness, but consciousness can come into contact with matter and become covered by it. So that's what I talk about in that book, Human Devolution. And I give scientific evidence showing that there is a conscious self that can exist apart from the body, that there is a subtle mind element that has some very unusual powers. Some might call them paranormal powers. And people would often ask me, well, how are you able to introduce these ideas into scientific circles? So my most recent book is called My Science, My Religion. It's a collection of 24 papers that I've presented at mainstream scientific conferences. Many people are very amazed that I'm able to do that I'm able to present these kinds of revolutionary ideas in the mainstream scientific circles. But this book, My Science, My Religion, is proof of how I'm able to do that. And then other people have asked for more simple to read presentations of my ideas. So I've collected the columns that I write for Atlantis Rising magazine in a book that I call The Forbidden Archaeologist. That's the name of the column that I write for Atlantis Rising magazine. So it's a collection of 50 of those columns, and they're all short, very easy to read, a very good introduction to my work for people who aren't very familiar with it.
Well, thank you for that, Michael. And yeah, no shortage of information out there available to anybody that's interested in this. And I personally feel that this question of human origins and where we've come from, well, I'm interested also in the ancient interpretation of that. When you go back to these, ancient Vedic texts, the Puranas, and many, many other ancient texts, they have quite the story to tell. And I wondered, from your perspective and your experience debating this, sort of the mainstream scientific community on this subject, what do we have coming out of these ancient Vedic literatures that is so compelling and that we're now seeing in the evidential research aspect of this? So what I'm basically asking is, we've got these ancient so-called myths and legends about our origins, and the mainstream scientific community views them as such. It views them as just fables, stories, whatever. But then your work, and there's now a growing body of work coming out that's showing that no, a lot of what is actually being talked about is in fact true. Did you have any examples that you could share on that?
Well, yes, and you're right. My work is largely inspired by my studies in the ancient Sanskrit writings of India, which are collectively called the Vedas, or the Vedic literature. Veda is a Sanskrit word. It means knowledge. So there are various types of knowledge that are explained in the Vedic text. Some of the texts are historical in nature. They are the Puranas. Purana means the literature that has to deal with history, things that are old. Purana is a Sanskrit word. It actually means old. So it was actually from my studies in the Puranas, which I learned about when I was in my 20s. I had been searching for a spiritual path, and I became the disciple of a guru from India, Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. And through him, I began studying these ancient writings. One of them in particular was called the Bhagavad Purana. And in it, I first encountered this idea of extreme human antiquity, this idea that humans like us have existed for millions of years on Earth. And it's something that you also find in the writings of other ancient wisdom traditions. You know, the idea that humans, practically speaking, have always been present on Earth. So that was something completely different than I'd ever learned from any of my teachers in high school or university. So I began to wonder, well, is that just mythology? Is it just some interesting story that was made up by these ancient people? Or is there perhaps some factual basis for this idea of extreme human antiquity? And that's what got me looking into the history of archaeology, because if you look in the current textbooks today, you're not going to find any evidence for extreme human antiquity. You're only going to find the discoveries that support the current idea that humans like us came into existence less than 200,000 years ago, having evolved from more primitive ape-like ancestors. So when I started the research, I really didn't know what I was going to find. And, you know, what I decided to do was look beyond today's textbooks, look into the original scientific reports written by archaeologists, geologists, paleontologists, and other scientists who are digging into the Earth. Let me look at the original reports, not what's in the textbooks. And let me look not just at the more recent ones, but let me look at all the reports from the time of Darwin all the way up to the present. And let me look not just in those that are printed in English, but in other different languages. Because of the way I was raised, I was, you know, born in a military family, and our family moved all over the world, and I learned different languages. We were in Germany for some time, so I learned German. And so I have a reading knowledge of most of the major European languages. So I decided, okay, let me start looking into these original reports. And I thought, well, maybe I'll find one or two interesting things. I'll write a short article about it, and then I'll move on to some other aspect of this ancient wisdom and knowledge. But when I started my research, which I thought might last 8 days, I found that the 8 days turned into 8 weeks, and the 8 weeks turned into 8 months, and the 8 months turned into 8 years. Because when I found one case, it led to another, which led to another, which led to another, which led to another. In other words, I would read in the report of some European scientist that human skeletal remains were found in some very ancient layers of rock. And then the author would mention in a little footnote. And some other scientists reported the same thing. So I tracked that report down. And it just didn't end. I could see that there weren't just a few of these cases of human bones, human footprints, and human artifacts many millions of years old. There were hundreds of them. So I collected them together and put them in that book, Forbidden Archaeology, which is about 900 pages long. So I could see that it wasn't what these ancient writings were telling us was not mythological. It was factual that humans really did exist. Somebody might think, well, what difference does it make whether human beings lived in the distant past or whether they evolved from apes and monkeys fairly recently? What difference does it make? And it actually does make a big difference, because our goals and our values and our objectives are largely formed by the answers that we give to the fundamental questions: who am I and where did I come from? So, for example, if I think, okay, I'm an American man, then I behave like that. If I think I'm this or that, then I behave like that. So it's our sense of identity that gives us our values and our goals and our objectives. And for the past century or two, the supporters of the Darwinian theory of evolution have been able to dictate the answers to those fundamental questions. They've been teaching people that really you're just machines made of matter, you're evolved apes. In other words, they're giving extremely materialistic answers to these fundamental questions: who am I? Where did I come from? So it's no surprise to me, therefore, that our present worldwide human civilization has become extremely materialistic in terms of its values and its goals. And I think that's one of the things that's at the root of the world's environmental crisis, which has been brought about by overproduction and overconsumption of material things, by this process of overproducing and overconsuming. We are poisoning the air, poisoning the land, poisoning the water. We're consuming the Earth's resources at an unsustainable rate. And it's also something that drives a lot of the conflict that we see in the world, because we're being taught by the current supporters of the Darwinian theory of evolution that not only are we just machines made of matter, evolved apes, we are machines made of matter in competition with each other for survival.
Exactly.
So I think that's partially, at least partially, what lies at the root at the very intense levels of conflict that we see on all levels of human society. There's conflict among individuals, conflict among races, conflict among nations, conflict among classes, conflict among religions even. So I think the solution to all those problems lies in developing a new sense of self, a new identity, getting new answers to these fundamental questions: who am I and where did I come from? I think the alternatives to the current materialistic answers to those questions lie in a more spiritual direction. So the real answer to the question, who am I, is I'm a being of pure consciousness. I'm not a machine made of matter in competition with other machines made of matter for survival. Actually, not only am I a being of pure consciousness, you're a being of pure consciousness, and everybody is ultimately a being of pure consciousness.
And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. You're listening to Truth Warrior on truthfrequencyradio.com. I'm your host, David Whitehead, and I'm speaking tonight to Mr. Michael Cremo, mcremo.com or forbiddenarchaeology.com. And fantastic summation there in the first segment with Michael, and we're going to get into a bunch of questions here. But as he was speaking about the current condition related to, I guess, the amnesia that we're experiencing about our past and this confused state that we're in, where we don't really have any proper navigational tools, so to speak, because of the fact that we haven't even nailed down the most basic question in my mind, which is what is our history? Where do we come from? You know, and these are things that are huge, and it does so much damage, I think, to the psyche that you don't even have an origin in your mind of where you come from. And there's so many other subsequent things that come up and start creating these negative traits and all these negative traits that we see now in our society, because we're living in a state of untruth, of unknowing, of ignorance. And so we're trying to clear that up and get down to the bottom of these very, very important and fundamental questions. And I couldn't help but think about that famous quote from George Orwell, where he says, "He who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past." And welcome back, Michael. I just wanted to allow you to continue, but also bring up this concept or this question about why there is such an effort to block this information from coming out in, I guess you would call it, the mainstream public discourse. Why has the academic circles focused all of their efforts, time, money, and energy on only pushing the Darwinian model of human origins? And on the other hand, you have various religious groups that are also well-funded and have a lot of airtime and a lot of influence, and they're also given run to bring their view forward. And yet both views are totally missing the boat. They have huge gaps in their theories. They don't have the access, or they're not presenting the evidence that you're putting forward and many others are bringing forward now. So why does this continue? In your experience, you've been doing this a long time. Why is there such a blockage there? Why are they not allowing this or not wanting this to come out in the mainstream?
Well, I think there's a lot of reasons for that. First of all, it's human nature in one sense. Because, say, for example, if I love somebody and then someone tells me something bad about the person I love, I don't want to believe it. I may even become a little bit angry at the person who tells me. And today, most scientists are very much in love with the Darwinian theory of evolution. They just love it. If they hear something that goes against the theory that they so deeply love, they don't want to believe it, and they may even become a little bit angry at the persons who try to raise some doubts about it or give some evidence that contradicts it. So in one sense, it's just human nature. And on a deeper level, it has something to do, which is also concerned with human nature. It has to do with power. There's a lot of different kinds of power in the world. There's military power, there's political power, there's economic power. There's also intellectual power, which is a very subtle power, but a very real one. And you were mentioning that nice quote from George Orwell, his book, I think 1984, I believe, where he was saying those who control the present control the past, those who control the past control the present. And that's very real. So those who have power, particularly those who have monopoly power, generally want to keep it. For example, if one political party has a monopoly on the political life of the country, it wants to keep its position. Or if one big corporation has a monopoly in a certain sector of the economy, it wants to keep its position of dominance. So for the past 100 years or so, the supporters of the Darwinian theory of evolution in most countries have gotten a government-enforced monopoly in the education systems and the scientific institutions. And only their ideas can be taught. So that's, in one sense, you could say a nice position to be in, that only your ideas can be taught, all other ideas are excluded, and the supporters of those other ideas are labeled in a very negative way. In one sense, if you're into power and things like that's a good position to be in. So naturally, anytime there's a challenge to that position, it's going to be resisted, and there are going to be attempts to put down such challenges. So, and you still might ask, but why? And I think it's because the alternatives to the current ideas generally involve some non-materialistic principles. As I said, the ideas that are being promoted now about who we are and where we came from are very materialistic. So there are, in my opinion, powerful influences, powerful groups in society that like it, that people think they are machines made of matter in competition with each other for survival. That means they can play off the fears and the material greed and desires that such persons have. They can be manipulated in many different ways to the benefit of the groups that are controlling all of this. So, for example, if people think that to produce and consume more and more material things is the main purpose of human life, that means they're going to be supporting huge corporations that are involved in all this production and marketing of so many things. And if they buy into this idea that we're machines made of matter in competition with other machines made of matter for survival, that's going to support a lot of the emphasis on military conflict and armed conflict on various levels. And it's also going to drive the destruction of the Earth's environment. So the members of the scientific community, their role in all of this is to define the mentality of the people, give them their sense of identity, give them a materialistic sense of identity. Say if people had a different sense of identity, well, we're all beings of pure consciousness, we're all related to each other, our main purpose of life is not to produce and consume more and more material things to the maximum extent possible. Our purpose in life is to develop the resource of consciousness, and we should satisfy our material needs cooperatively in the most simple, natural, and efficient way possible. There would be an entirely different kind of political and economic setup if we were just trying to satisfy our needs in the most simple and natural and efficient way possible. We wouldn't have so many of these huge industrial enterprises that are stripping the earth of its resources and driving the whole process of environmental destruction. If people were understanding we're all beings of pure consciousness, they wouldn't be dividing themselves up into so many competing groups and fighting with each other in huge wars every few years. So I think the key for keeping this whole system going is keeping people thinking we are machines made of matter in competition with each other for survival. And I think there's a lot of political and economic and financial and military institutions that depend on keeping people in that mentality. So that's why I think there's such resistance to any idea that would disturb that status quo.
And it's such an important point, Michael, and I've thought about this many times myself when I see the mentality of those that are enforcing this system on every level, especially when you read just the mindset behind something like Darwinism, which can be taken in a social sense and applied socially and said, look, you are, as you said, a bunch of mechanical, ape-like beings, and therefore you're out of control and you need to be controlled. and it justifies the need for these different control mechanisms to come in, as opposed to an expansive way of viewing yourself in the world, which would be there to empower the individual. And let's be honest, the society that's been built up around us is not geared towards supporting the freedom of the individual, but instead it's more of a collectivist mentality that says, hey, you need to be led, you need to be governed, you need to be ruled. And if we as human beings are severed from knowing our true origin and our true purpose and our true expanded awareness and our higher consciousness as human beings on this planet, then we are easily vulnerable. And I guess the way I've always looked at it when analyzing the scientific community on this, that it's very compartmentalized. This doesn't mean every single scientist out there is in on some kind of thing, or they're getting paid off in that way. But what happens is that up the structure, closer to the top, you have the influences of getting that grant money and that research money from these big foundations that are going to invest money in your project so that you can get the proper investigation going. I guess when you started looking into this research and speaking to many scientists that were coming up with these types of discoveries, I can think of people you've mentioned many times, like Virginia Steen McIntyre and many others who've been blocked. Does it come from the lower level scientific community, or is it something that's imposed where they just cut off the grant, they just try to smear their name publicly and shut them down? How does that mechanism of controlling this information work in your view?
Well, I think you've kind of laid it out pretty well yourself. Here's the kind of thing that can happen. There was Dr. John E. Mack, who was head of the psychiatry department at Harvard University Medical School. He became interested in what's called alien abduction reports. The idea that some people on Earth report having been abducted by beings from other levels of reality or other parts of the universe. And that's something that challenges many of the accepted ideas in science today. And he began publishing papers about that, and he began studying this very deeply. He thought perhaps these people are just victims of some kind of neurosis or psychosis. But as he began to carefully study the people that were reporting these kinds of experiences, he found that they were not displaying any signs of neurosis or psychosis. Rather, they were displaying signs of post-traumatic stress. For example, like a soldier who's in a big battle might develop post-traumatic stress disorder, or somebody who's been in some big natural disaster, they might develop that. So he determined, that these people were reporting real experiences, and they were showing the symptoms that you would expect of someone who had gone through such an experience. And when he did that, his colleagues at Harvard University convened an academic court to remove him from his position. So that's the kind of thing that can happen if somebody steps outside the accepted boundaries. And you mentioned the case of Virginia Steen McIntyre. She was a geologist, and she was invited to an archaeological site in Mexico at a place called Huayatlaco to use her skills as a geologist to help the archaeologists determine how old the site was there. And she and her colleagues used 4 different methods to date that site, and they came up with an age of about 300,000 years. But the archaeologists refused to accept that. According to their theories, human beings capable of making the kinds of artifacts that were found at that site didn't exist anywhere in the world 300,000 years ago. They hadn't evolved yet. And what to speak of being present in North America? The current dominant idea is that there were no human beings in North America, Canada, the United States, Mexico, any earlier than about 20,000 years ago. So to have this kind of evidence in Mexico at 300,000 years ago was just totally inconceivable to the archaeologists who were in charge of the site. So they refused to publish the age for the site given by Virginia Steen McIntyre and her colleagues. And not only that, when Virginia Steen McIntyre and her colleagues independently published the age for the site, they experienced an extreme negative backlash from their colleagues in the scientific world. Up to that point, Virginia Steen McIntyre had been an up-and-coming young scientist. She was getting grant money. She had a position at a university. But after she published this report, which contradicted the Darwinian theory of evolution, she found her career as a geologist was finished. So this can happen. And I think one reason it happens like this is because the supporters of the current theories have managed to convince governments to give them a monopoly in the education system. In other words, students aren't presented with the full range of alternatives and allowed to make up their own minds about these things. They're presented with one idea, and all other ideas are marginalized
and they're portrayed as being then experts in all of these of aspects of this question. They come out with a degree or, from a university, and then now they're the final word and they become the authority on addressing anybody that comes up with another alternative view, especially when they bring new evidence forward. So
Right.
It becomes a problem, right?
Yeah. So because they have this monopoly in the education system, and it means they're able to marginalize all the other ideas that are out there. So if a student is going through this system, through high school and university and graduate work at university to be trained as a scientist, they're trained in only one way of thinking, and they're taught to regard everything else as illegitimate somehow. It's as if, say, in a country that has a parliamentary system, you might have many different parties, and there might be a small political party, but somebody might vote for that small political party just because they believe in their ideas. For example, it may be a green political party or something that isn't in the majority. It's not going to control the government or anything. But just because on principle a person agrees with the ideas or the program of that party, they vote for it. And who knows, maybe someday it will become a majority party. But if you outlaw that little political party, then nobody can identify it. They'll be put on some government watch list. They'll be discriminated against. So it's sort of a similar idea in the education system today. There actually are different opinions among some scientists about these fundamental questions that have to do with the origin of life and the origin of consciousness. But the supporters of the dominant materialistic ideas have managed to convince government to give them a monopoly in the education system, which means only their ideas can be taught. The alternative would be to present students with a full range of ideas and then let them make up their own minds. But that would be, if that were done, then I think a lot of what are now called minority ideas would gradually grow in influence and popularity. So I think that's why they resist, like anything, the idea of introducing alternatives into the education system.
Which is interesting to me. Oh, sorry to cut you off there, Michael, but as you're talking, I'm thinking, it's just so interesting to me that they're so afraid of that happening. When our education system and every element in our modern society today is showcased to everybody like, oh, it's free, it's open debate, you have a free speech and all of these different rights granted to you. This is the modern, advanced, civilized society, even though there's war and corruption and crime still happening and poverty on unprecedented scales all around us. But the idea that they want to suppress this information by cordoning it off right at the educational level, and then in the media, and then in the actual field of research itself. It's just like, why are they so afraid of that happening? If it was such bunk, if it was such a fallacy to think that the human race could be millions of years old, what are they afraid of, really, is really, I guess, what it comes down to. And as we said before, they don't want these kinds of ideas floating out there because they don't want real free speech or real freedom of information or real free thinkers out there, because that's a major threat to a system that has invested so much in slavery. That's just the way I see it.
Yeah, and I think the fundamental principle that lies behind it is the institutions that are now dominant in the world today depend on people having very materialistic ideas about themselves, so that they see, their main purpose in life as producing more and more material things, and when they're not working on producing them, they're consuming them. And if there's any disturbance of that, it causes major shockwaves in the world's political, financial, and economic systems. If production and consumption goes down by 1 or 2%, it just creates total shockwaves, because they depend on people just being good producers and consumers of more and more materialistic things. If people were thinking, well, actually, if huge numbers of people were thinking, actually, I'd like to live a little more simply and naturally and put more of my time and energy into developing my consciousness, that would be horrifying for the type of, because it would mean, well, you wouldn't be buying things, you wouldn't be working, you wouldn't. And actually, in the world today, they've managed to commercialize everything, even social interactions. That's probably one of the big economic advances of the past 20 years, that now they've managed to commercialize just your relations with your friends and relatives. That things that you used to do just on your own, now you do through a system that's making money for people.
It's just off your everyday life and your activities. They're able to track you and advertise directly to you. And of course, also we know the government collects that kind of information for their purposes as well. But Michael, we're just going to go to our midpoint break here. I'd like to continue this line on the other side. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Cremo is here. We got another segment coming up. I'm going to open up the phone lines. We'll hear some of your questions. And we'll be back in a few short minutes. Don't go anywhere.
Real people, real radio. Wherever you you are. Make it TFR. Truth Frequency Radio.
And welcome back, everyone. Second hour underway here on Truth Warrior. I'm your host, David Whitehead. We're coming at you from truthfrequencyradio.com. And I'm speaking tonight to the one and only Michael Cremo. An absolutely fascinating man who's done some groundbreaking work over the years. His contribution is immeasurable, in my opinion. And I highly recommend you go to his website, forbiddenarchaeology.com. Check out his books. There's a variety of interviews and videos and documentaries on his work on YouTube. Just some fantastic information, and definitely paradigm shattering for some. But I think that that's what this time is all about. I think we are in an age of transition from one model of existence, and hopefully we are in the process of evolving to another state of existence where maybe we can get some answers to these questions. We can achieve a much more balanced state of equilibrium with the external world and the internal world. And hopefully we can have peace, prosperity, and abundance for everybody. But we do have to get through these types of times that we're in right now and shattering a lot of the myths that are holding us back from going to that next stage. And I think it's important that we question what we think we know. Even myself, I go back to my own ideas on a lot of these subjects, and I think, where did I come to a place in my mind where I think I know something? Where did I get that information? And when you really start to trace it, and you say, okay, I was shown this in school, I was taught this in Sunday school, or I was shown this by a friend of mine, or someone very influential in my life showed me this information, and then I just went with it, and I made up my mind. And from that day forward, I never questioned it again, and that became my opinion. And what I've always tried to do is ask myself, is this really my opinion? Is my opinion educated? Is it an educated opinion? Or am I just regurgitating someone else's opinion? And I think that we've just been batting this back and forth for so long as a species, especially these important questions, that it's time we started opening up our minds and doing some actual investigation into these questions. And there's also that level of intuition that has to go into it. And that's kind of where I wanted to continue off with Michael, is how that has been mostly missing from the way that the mainstream scientific community has brought information forward, especially from such a mechanical view. They look at the brain as just being like a computer, and that's it. Once the brain's dead, lights out, there is no consciousness driving the machine. It's just a machine. So from that point, there's not really a need to discuss the area of intuition or looking into ancient myths and legends and trying to get different perspectives on something. They look at that as all bunk. And although I'm glad to see that it is changing to some degree, but the idea of looking at information and analyzing evidence and synthesizing data that you're coming across, you're going to have that intellectual side where you need to really validate it and use the scientific method and verify it and do all the carbon dating and do all the analysis and have other peers look at it. But then there's also that other side that often gets missed. And that's that intuitive side where you connect to another dimension of thought, and you connect to something that is rooted in, I believe is rooted in all of us. I believe these histories, you call it the Akashic record, you call it the primordial field, you call it, the matrix of all matter, whatever you want to think of it as. We are connected to that, and we do have access to this information on some level. I think it's deeply embedded in us. You even get into things like genetic memory and epigenetics, which is a new field in science that's really shattering a lot of old myths. And when you bring that all together, you start to realize that we need a balanced approach to looking at these questions. So, Michael, I wondered if you could maybe share some of your thoughts on that, and maybe some of the experiences you've had looking into this question of human origins and using that approach of, yes, the scientific analysis, but also that intuitive faculty as well.
Well, I think you're really right about that, David, that we should be developing that resource of consciousness that's within us. And consciousness is not just some byproduct of bioelectrical activity in the brain. As you said, this can be studied from a scientific point of view. We can study different types of scientific evidence that would actually support the idea that consciousness has its own independent existence apart from matter. But it's something that can be understood not just on an intellectual level, an abstract intellectual level, but it's something that can be deeply experienced. And I think it's therefore important that people take advantage of the different systems of yoga and meditation and contemplation that are there in the world's great wisdom traditions, so that one can spend some time getting some direct experience of these things. Of course, we all do have some direct experience of these things. First of all, we can appreciate, all of us, that we are conscious. If I wasn't conscious and you weren't conscious and the listeners weren't conscious, we wouldn't be having this experience of having this conversation if we weren't conscious beings. And where does that consciousness come from? I believe ultimately it's emanating not from chemicals, not from molecules, but it's emanating from the soul. I would use the word conscious self, because if I use the word soul, then people think, well, that's religious, that requires belief, it requires faith, maybe it exists, maybe it doesn't, who knows. But if we use the term conscious self, who can deny it? Every one of us is conscious. It's the most direct and real experience that we have. It doesn't require faith. You don't have faith that you're conscious. You directly experience it. And to say that you're a self, well, that's something that we also directly experience. I'm a self, you're a self, each of the listeners is a self, each with their own independent consciousness. So that is something we can all experience it. Of course, sometimes we don't think about these things. We just get totally absorbed in whatever the media is presenting to us and whatever goals that our society has imposed upon us. And we don't stop to think, who am I really? And what are my real interests? And I think our main interest should be understanding, what is the nature of this consciousness, of this self that I am, which appears to have an existence apart from the body. As I said, there are medical studies of these things. There have been medical studies done of out-of-body experiences. I talk about these in my book, Human Devolution. For example, there are times when a person should be completely unconscious, as during a heart attack. The heart stops beating, blood stops flowing to the brain. Medical instruments show that the brain waves stop. At a moment like that, a person should be unconscious, yet many people in that condition report remaining conscious and separating from their bodies, and they look down and they see what the doctors and nurses are doing to revive them. And there are medical doctors who've studied this phenomenon. They've wondered, are these people just making up stories, or are they reporting real experiences? So they've done studies. For example, Dr. Michael Sabum, a cardiologist in the United States, heard reports like this from some of his heart attack patients. And he wanted to know, are they telling the truth, or are they just making up something? So what he did is he carefully interviewed each of the patients who had reported these out-of-body experiences, and he carefully recorded everything they observed, everything they saw the doctors and nurses doing. And then he went to the doctors and nurses who had treated these patients and revived them from their heart attacks. And he looked carefully at their detailed medical records, and he found that the descriptions given by the patients matched the descriptions given by the doctors and nurses in their medical reports. So he was able to verify that, yes, these people are reporting true experiences. So that is one level in which you could look at this, objectively looking at medical studies of out-of-body experiences and rationally considering what the implications of that are. But it's also possible for some people, the people that are having these kinds of experiences, for them it's not like a rational intellectualization. It's something that they've actually consciously experienced.
Right, yeah.
And I remember once I had an experience like that myself. It was when I was in my early 20s. I was in the United States Navy, and I was stationed in Iceland at a weather station there. And during my free time, I would go with my friends camping out in Iceland. It's a very beautiful country, very wild, exotic country. And once we were camping in the winter in Iceland near some mountains. They don't have huge mountains there, but they've got small mountains, a few thousand feet tall. And we were out camping, a few of us, and we decided to have a race to the top of one of the mountains that was nearby, a few thousand feet tall. So a few of us, we started going up, and I was going up, climbing over rocks and ice and snow. And when I was almost at the top, I slipped and I started going down the mountain on my back with my head downward. And like I said, it was in the wintertime, so there was a lot of ice and snow. So I was going down the mountain on my back, and I was trying to stop. I was trying to dig my heels into the ground, my elbows into the ground or whatever, seeing if I could stop myself. And I was just thinking of all the sharp rocks I had climbed over or the cliffs that I had gone by, and I was just thinking, at any moment, the back of my head is just going to hit one of those rocks, and it's going to split my skull open, or I'm going to go over one of those cliffs, and that's going to be it. So I was trying like anything to stop myself. At a certain point, I just realized there's nothing I can do, so just mentally, I let go. And when I mentally let go like that, I experienced myself looking at myself from a perspective outside my body going down the mountain. And then I blacked out during that out-of-body experience. And I woke up at the bottom of the mountain in a snowdrift, and some of my Navy friends, were trying to wake me up, and I woke up. So sometimes, as I said, we can talk about these things in terms of scientific evidence and intellectual rationalizations and things of that sort, but it's also possible to have some direct experiences of these things, which could happen in an accidental way, as I've just explained, or sometimes through the practice of some type of meditation or contemplation. And there are different systems of meditation. I've been practicing a system of meditation for over 40 years. I meditate on the Hare Krishna mantra, but I'm not claiming to have any kind of monopoly on truth or anything like that, but there are various systems in a lot of different traditions. And I think they're there for people to take advantage of if they want to explore that more experiential or intuitive nature of the conscious self, really dig more deeply into it. Of course, that's not going to contribute to the economy of the nation that you live in. But,
yeah, but I mean, you're right. It's experiential, and what happens is so many people that come forward with these types of experiences, and they could be of any kind of what is considered paranormal or phenomenal type experiences like that. They get marginalized by those rationalists out there that want hard scientific journals that in front of them, and they want to read through all this data study and whatnot. Yet the experiencer knows what they experienced. Like when you were flying down that mountain at a breakneck pace, you experienced that. And I've spoken to many other people. I've had some of my own experiences, and it's something that you can never really offer full proof to somebody, but it does add itself to this whole discourse about this subject. And I mean, what do you think about the ancients and how they were writing these kinds of things down? I mean, we're going back into some of this literature from the ancient past. You're talking about the Vedic texts and the Puranas and whatnot. There's all kinds of stories in there. And there's also oral traditions and whatnot that have passed these kinds of stories and experiences down, and these various methodologies that you can use to achieve these states of experience. But they come forward and they start bringing this forward. And yet in our modern time, nobody really wants to take a look at that. Is there not a rich body of what you might call evidence of this type of experience, even coming from the ancient world?
Yes, from the ancient world. And there are also some cases of scientists becoming involved in questions like this as well. For example, Alfred Russel Wallace was an English scientist who lived in the 19th century. He was a contemporary of Charles Darwin. And actually, he, along with Darwin, was the co-founder of the theory of evolution by natural selection. Actually, what had happened is, like Darwin, as a young man, had gone on a voyage around the world, and he'd kind of come up with this idea of evolution. And he got back to England, and he started thinking about it some more, and he started writing a book. But he was writing this book for 20 years, and it never quite got finished. But one day, in the mail, he got a letter from Wallace, Alfred Russel Wallace, this other English scientist. And in this letter, Wallace said to Darwin, I'd like you to read this paper that I've written. It's going to be presented at a scientific institution in London very soon, and I thought you might be interested in it. So in this paper, Wallace had laid out the theory of evolution by natural selection, and Darwin was just shocked, because the way things work in the scientific world is the first person who puts out a theory gets their name on it. Like if Einstein puts out the theory of relativity, it's Einstein's theory of relativity. If Wallace puts out the theory of evolution by natural selection, it's Wallace's theory of evolution by natural selection. So Darwin had been working on his theory, his book, The Origin of Species, for about 20 years, and he was just shocked that this other scientist had come up with the same idea and was going to publish it, present it at a scientific conference. So he called together some of his scientific friends and explained the situation to them. And they said, well, there's only one thing you could do. You could write to Wallace and ask, would he mind if you presented a paper at the same scientific conference at the same time? And that way, because you both presented the idea at the same time, you'll both get credit for it. He won't get the sole credit. So Wallace agreed to that. And Wallace and Darwin presented their papers at this scientific conference in London, and the theory of evolution was first called the Wallace-Darwin theory of evolution. Now you may wonder, why isn't it still called the Wallace-Darwin theory? It's because Wallace became interested in what we might call the paranormal. He became interested in the idea that there's more to a human being than just chemical elements. There is a conscious self which appears to be separate from matter. There's also a subtle mental body that has paranormal powers like extrasensory perception, mind over matter, psychokinesis, and things like that. And he got deeply involved in studying, doing scientific research into the paranormal. So Darwin and his scientific colleagues were just shocked by this. They were just shocked that this very prominent scientist had become involved in such things. So they kind of had a divorce, you could say. And Wallace's name was dropped from the theory, and he just pursued his research into the paranormal. He was doing experiments with mediums. Mediums are people who have paranormal powers, and he did experiments with them. He determined their powers were real. So if people knew the actual history of science, they would find it's a lot more strange than they now think, and that it involves a lot more things that are now, today, research into the paranormal is considered unscientific, but Wallace thought it was perfectly scientific. And there are other examples of scientists who have ventured into these realms, like Pierre and Marie Curie. Now, they're very famous. They were husband and wife. They both got Nobel Prizes in physics for their work in discovering radium early in the 20th century. You'll read about that in every high school physics textbook. Marie Curie is especially very famous because she's one of the few examples of a woman in science who was recognized by a Nobel Prize. So that's in all the textbooks. What you don't read in the textbooks is that they were heavily involved in psychical research into the paranormal. They would, she and her husband and other scientists in Europe were doing experiments with mediums who had psychokinetic abilities. For example, they were doing experiments with an Italian medium named Eusapia Palladino, and they had her in the laboratory of the Psychology Institute in Paris one day. And in the presence of this woman, a large table was floating in the laboratory about 3 feet off the ground. And Pierre Curie was timing how long it was floating and how high it was floating. And just after years of experiments like that, they signed documents saying these things are absolutely true. That these powers of the mind have to be recognized if we're going to have a complete picture of reality. So you've got the evidence from the ancient wisdom traditions. There you have accounts of, say, in the ancient Sanskrit writings of yogis who manifested mystic powers that were called siddhis. They could do things like travel through outer space to other planets, to other dimensions, just by manipulating their minds and consciousness. They could see things at a distance. Today that's called remote viewing. And actually the United States government had a program in the 1970s and 80s where they used people with this remote viewing power to see what was going on in the Soviet Union and other parts of the world that they were interested in.
Yeah, they invested quite a bit of money into that program, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, millions of dollars. So there's a huge amount of evidence for these things. There's the evidence that comes from the ancient wisdom traditions, like the yogic siddhis of ancient India, siddhis, not cities, Siddhis, or the shamanic powers of Native American Indian shamans, or so there's a huge body of evidence for these things coming from folk wisdom and ancient knowledge traditions. And there's also actually a huge body of evidence from scientific sources, although it's been excluded from today's textbooks. But people actually...
So sorry to jump in there again, Michael. Brilliant point. We're going to go to our final break of the show. We've got one more segment here, ladies and gentlemen, with Michael Cremo, and we're definitely going to open up the phone lines if you want to pop in a question. So we'll be back here on Truth Warrior in a few minutes. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. And welcome back, folks. 1-866-378-7884 is the number if you want to try to squeeze in a question in this last segment. We've got about 20 minutes left here with Michael Cremo. mcremo.com and forbiddenarchaeology.com are his websites. I know he's got a list of other websites as well, but definitely go there and check out his work. And I am also very excited to once again let you know that we will be featuring Michael on the upcoming Modern Knowledge Tour. We're bringing him down to Canada. He's going to be visiting the Vancouver stop and the Victoria stop. He's going to be speaking alongside Nassim Harriman, Dr. Carmen Bolter, Marty Leeds. We've got some other exciting Skype guests that are going to be joining us for that event. So we've got some fantastic events lined up coming across Canada this year for the first time. And as I said before, we're going to do our very best to live stream one or more of those events so that you can take part if you can't physically make it. Although we do encourage you to come down and try to get involved in the event. It's a great atmosphere. You're going to meet a lot of great people, and you get a chance to maybe meet some of these speakers as well and interact with them directly, which is the point. So if you want more information on tickets and the information about those events, head over to modernknowledge.ca, and all the information is there for you. So welcome back, Michael. You were just closing off the last segment there talking about the different types of evidence for basically non-locality, or the fact that we are more than just this physical hunk of meat or this sort of machine-like creature that's just wandering aimlessly throughout the universe on this planet that we call Earth. You were going through the scientific evidence as we were cut off there, and I wanted you to maybe finish up any point that you had there. And then I wanted to ask you the question if any of your work personally has ever been directly attacked or suppressed in any way by the mainstream establishment. I'm sure it has, but if you had any experiences to share, feel free.
Okay. Just to wrap up what I was talking about before the break, there's a lot of evidence that we are beings of pure consciousness. We are not just machines made of matter. Consciousness is not produced by chemicals in the brain. Mind is not just bioelectrical activity produced temporarily by the brain. There is a real conscious self. There is a real mind element that has paranormal powers. And there's evidence for this that comes from science, if you actually look at the whole history of science and not just the edited version of science that you see in today's textbooks. If it's also there in many of the world's ancient wisdom traditions, not just the ancient ones, but the ones that are still surviving today. And it's also something we can all experience ourselves. We all have a sense that we're something more than just machines made of matter if we really look deeply into ourselves and take advantage of the different systems of meditation and contemplation that are available to us. As far as my experiences in presenting these kinds of ideas in scientific circles and at universities around the world, first thing I'd like to say is not all scientists are in this very negative, closed-minded space, I've found basically three kinds of reactions from scientists to my work. One group of scientists I call the fundamentalist materialist. And these are scientists who are convinced that everything about us can be explained by chemical interactions of matter. We're just machines made of matter as far as they're concerned. There is no soul. We don't need to think of any higher power in the universe. We're all there is, and we're just byproducts of chemistry. That's their idea. And I think it's not that these scientists are purely motivated by scientific evidence. If they were, they would have different ideas. I think it's their prior commitment to materialism and atheism that motivates them to express ideas like that. So these fundamentalist materialists, they're very powerful in the world of science today, and they don't like the kinds of ideas that I'm expressing. They don't want to hear them, and they don't want anyone else to hear them. So sometimes, they've tried to stop lectures that I've been scheduled to give at universities in different parts of the world, or they would object to me speaking at a university, or somehow I was able to speak at their university. They'll come and try to disrupt things. So, actually, an example of that that happened recently at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas, where I was invited to give a talk about my book, Human Devolution, and an atheistic scientist turned up to try to disturb the question session. And that's on YouTube. If you search on YouTube for Michael Cremo, University of Nevada, Las Vegas, UNLV, Human Devolution, it'll come up and you can check it out yourself. But fortunately, these fundamentalist materialists are not the only scientists that there are in the scientific world. There's another group that's a little more open-minded. They may be supporters of the current theories, but they're open-minded enough to be able to listen to alternative ideas. And it's scientists in that category who have invited me to speak at universities and scientific institutions around the world. They may not agree with me, but they're open-minded enough to be willing to listen to alternative ideas. And I think that's important, because if ideas are going to change, the first thing is people have to be willing to listen to new ideas. So fortunately, there are scientists in that kind of category. And they may be currently supporters of the now dominant theories, but for more or less really scientific reasons, not for any ideological reason. And that's a good thing. Now, among that group, there are some who actually would agree with the kinds of ideas that I express. Today, they're very few in number. They're a small minority. And I'm comfortable with being in a small minority that is actively resisted and suppressed. So
it's a good indication of sanity, Michael. It's a good indication.
Of course, sometimes you think, well, it'd be nice to be existing in a time and place when the kinds of ideas and convictions that I have were the dominant ideas and convictions in the world, but that isn't the situation today. So yes, I have had experiences of suppression, but I've also had experiences where scientists have welcomed me to present my ideas and given a respectful hearing. And as I said, my latest book, My Science, My Religion, is a collection of 24 papers that I was able to present at mainstream scientific conferences at the invitation of scientists in this category of open-minded scientists. So,
have you ever had any experience, Michael, where you feel your work has directly influenced another scientist or another researcher, where maybe they were very dubious before, which is natural, but then when they review the evidence, you see that you've sort of turned their perspective in a way?
Yes, that has happened. There are students, actually science students, who've encountered my work and have written to me saying that it's changed their ideas. There are even, as I said, my supporters among the professional scientific community at this moment are going to be small in number, but there are some who were influenced by my work to acknowledge some things they hadn't been aware of before. You know, for example, in my book, Forbidden Archaeology's Impact, I have included many statements of scientists who have read my books and have said things about them, and I've included in that book both the positive and the negative statements. So among some of the positive statements about my book, Forbidden Archaeology, were some made by a prominent historian of science named David Oldroyd and a graduate student of his named Joe Wodak. They wrote a 26-page article about my book, Forbidden Archaeology, and they asked a question. They said, has this book made any contribution to the literature on paleoanthropology? You know, that's the science of human origins. And they said yes, for two reasons. They said, first of all, no scholar that they were familiar with had gone into the history of archaeology in such depth before. You know, they said and they're professional historians of science, especially dealing with the history of sciences like archaeology and geology. And they said, according to their experience, nobody had really gone into the history of archaeology in such depth before. And they thought that was a very good thing. And they also said that our book, Forbidden Archaeology, was important because it raised questions about scientific truth claims. In other words, they were saying today many scientists consider the current theories of human origins to be absolutely true, and they thought we had done a good job of problematizing, attaching that level of certainty to the current theories of human origin. So yes, I think sometimes it has happened that the work that I've done has had what I regard as a positive influence on even some of the mainstream scientists. But as I said, I don't want to paint a false picture that I've had a major impact in changing the whole direction of science today. It's still going very much in a materialistic direction, but I don't think it can continue to do that for very much longer, because they're only able to do that by government giving them a monopoly, an artificial monopoly in the education system. If there really was a free exchange of ideas in the education system, they wouldn't be able to keep that up. And now people aren't limited to the education system as their only source of knowledge. There's so many alternative mediums of communication developing where people can get alternative sources of knowledge. And I think eventually, and most people today, if you actually look at surveys, most people in North America today don't accept the Darwinian theory of evolution. They have experienced themselves personally paranormal experiences, and they accept the truth of these things. So if you've got a situation where you've got an elite in the education system that is relying on government support to keep its ideas intact, and the majority of people don't accept those ideas, I think that's an artificial situation that isn't going to go on forever.
Well, and it seems like the veil of so many different elements in our society today is coming down. Like even government's not too popular these days. The young people are questioning a lot more. They're going online for their information. They're not really just sitting in front of CNN or reading just a lot of the mainstream literature, even though they're inundated with it in school. It's to a point now where they're bored to tears of what they've been hearing from those areas, and they're going more and more online. They're looking for alternative, radio, TV, shows like this, work from people such as yourself. I speak to young people on a regular basis, and I think that is sort of where the hope lies in getting this information out. And I think we're also entering a time where people aren't just waiting for some establishment organization to make an official statement on something. People are looking to want to make up their own minds about these things, to contribute their own thoughts. I mean, if you go on YouTube and you just look at the amount of people that are just speaking their mind into a camera, into their phone, or filming something, or taking a book and pointing at the camera and recommending it to people. It's just, this conversation is going all over the place now in a way that was never possible before, as you were bringing up. And I'm personally very optimistic that not only in this area, but in so many other areas that have been holding us back, we're going to start to see some massive, massive change. And I'm just so glad that you've been involved in this fight for so long, Michael, and you've been up against the wall. I think you were bringing this out in a time, you were before your time, really, and it was definitely received well in some regards, but also heavily attacked. But that's how it happens in science. That's how truth comes to the surface. It has to be rejected. It has to be ridiculed. It has to be attacked. And then eventually it comes around as, oh yeah, that makes sense. You know what I mean? So I don't know. I'm very optimistic. Are you optimistic about this kind of information and subjects like this, especially when we're talking about human consciousness coming out more now?
Yes, I am, because I see that it's not that I just see it, it's my personal experience, but actually surveys have showed that huge numbers of people accept the kinds of things that we've been talking about. And, so that's a very hopeful sign. As I said, it's my personal experience that huge numbers of people are very interested in these things. And it's also something that you can verify by checking out surveys like the Gallup surveys on people's beliefs in evolution, people's beliefs in the paranormal, people's beliefs in things like UFOs and extraterrestrials and things like that. There are huge percentages of people that accept these things that are all kind of excluded from the mainstream education system.
I'm definitely hopeful, and I think that's great to see. And I mean, you brought up UFOs and extraterrestrials. We got about 6 minutes left here. Did you have any thoughts on the intervention theory, or the idea that there's been throughout human history, there's been influences from elsewhere that have played a role in maybe some of the confusion that exists in our history and what's really going on? Is there something else aside from just human beings and the life that was supposedly evolved here? Is there something else going on? Is there something else interacting with us in this planet, in your opinion?
Yes, I think that is the case. I think we're part of a whole cosmic hierarchy of beings. We're part of a multi-level cosmos with different types of beings existing on the different levels. And just as on the level that we're on now, the terrestrial level, we can see there are good and bad people, there are good and bad forces in society. On the higher levels of reality, there's similar diversity. So there may be, on the higher levels of reality, beings who are more and more, who are interested in selfishness, greed, exploitation, domination, and control, and they would try to exert their influence on our level of reality to push things in that direction. And on these higher levels, there are beings who are more into we are all beings of pure consciousness. We are all meant to live in loving harmony with each other, and they're trying to exert their influence on our level of reality. So I think ultimately, there are extraterrestrial influences on what's going on this level of reality in the world of our experience. Ultimately, at the topmost level of reality, I think it's dominated by pure consciousness and love and harmony, and it's only those who are resisting that are the problem, and those that are developing a mentality of egotism, selfishness, control, domination, exploitation, and like that. So,
and materialism, unfortunately, when there's not an acknowledgement of that higher source or that higher awareness or whatever term you want to give it, when that's taken out of the equation, as you said earlier, we're just left to the devices of this terrestrial realm, and we become trapped in a victim-like mentality as opposed to a fully realized, fully functional being of higher consciousness, right?
Right. So there are forces on this level of reality that are trying to keep things like that, and I would say these fundamentalist, materialist scientists and those who benefit from the type of mentality they're trying to instill in the people of the world, namely we're machines made of matter in competition with each other for survival. And then there's this other group. We're all beings of pure consciousness. We should be trying to satisfy our material needs cooperatively in the most simple, natural, and efficient way possible while trying to elevate our consciousness, putting most of our human energy into that. So the balance between those groups is what determines the kind of world that we experience. And right now, I would say the forces on the other side are more dominant in the world, which is why we experience so much of the unpleasantness that we see around us.
But it's going to change, folks, and it's going to change.
But it can change.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
it's up to us.
It's up to us. But just because it's raining, it doesn't mean you have to get wet. You can shelter yourself. You can shelter others, as many as you can.
Absolutely.
And push things in the right direction.
Absolutely. And let's hope that happens. Well, Michael, I'm actually very excited to be able to get the opportunity to meet you coming up soon here in summer of this year. We're looking forward to hosting you on the Modern Knowledge Tour and having you visit Victoria and Vancouver, two very beautiful Canadian cities. And I'm not sure if you've spoken there before, but we're very happy to host you there, and look forward to being able to listen to your full presentation there. So congratulations, and thanks for agreeing to join us on the tour this year.
Oh, I'm looking forward to it. I have appeared in Vancouver before, but not Victoria. I haven't been out to that island yet, so I'm really looking forward to that.
Oh, it's stunning. We'll have to take you around a little bit. Dr. Carmen Bolter, she lives on the island. She's a good friend, and I also got some family there. We go there quite regularly, and it is one of the most, British Columbia is a beautiful, beautiful place in Canada. In fact, Canada is highly underestimated. It's a beautiful country, a lot of great people here. I think it's going to be a fantastic event. You're going to get tons of great questions and meet lots of great people. And we're absolutely honored and thrilled that you've agreed to partake in that. And I'm also very honored that you agreed to come on the show tonight, Michael. I think this conversation has definitely given me a lot to think about and consider, as it always does when I listen to you and look into your work. So I greatly appreciate you spending the time with me here tonight, and would love to have you back in the future for a follow-up.
Well, that would be great. I'm definitely willing to do that.
That's awesome. Is there any other information you wanted to let people know about? Do you have any upcoming work or websites that you wanted to give to people?
Well, I mean, there are some things coming up in June. I'm going to be a speaker on a cruise that's going up to Alaska.
Nice.
And it's a spiritual cruise. There'll be a lot of spiritual people and healers and others into alternative ways of thinking who are going to be speakers on that cruise. In particular, I'm going to be speaking about similarities between the Native American Indian cosmology of the Tlingit tribe in that part of the world and the cosmology of the ancient Sanskrit writings of India. So I'm going to be on that cruise. If anybody would like to join on that, they can go to spiritualcruise.com, give me as a referral. And of course, I am looking forward to coming up to Victoria and Vancouver to speak at the Modern Knowledge Conference, and I believe it's August.
Absolutely, yeah.
Is that correct?
That's correct. Heading up end of August there.
28th and 29th.
That's right.
And I'm looking forward to that.
Well, we're about to get round out here, Mike.
I'm getting ready.
Sorry to cut you off. ForbiddenArchaeology.com, ladies and gentlemen.